Lectures. I would like to introduce, and our participants tend to kind of scatter in the next couple minutes. But while that's happening, I'd like to introduce everyone to Jay Shea. We're very excited for your lecture. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, is that a prompt for me to begin, or will you play the video now?
Yes. We're going to go ahead and play the video. And
Perfect. Thank you.
after that, we can have questions. People will type questions as it goes along. And then, at the end of the video, and then we can interact on the questions.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, all. My name is Jay Shah. I am the research director for AI ethics and health at the Joint Center for Bioethics at University of Toronto, and an associate professor in the Department of Physical Therapy at that university as well. I trained as a physical therapist and worked in it for a couple of years in community care while doing my PhD, and so find myself in a home that is in a Department of Physical Therapy now. And I supervise grad students in our Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation at University of Toronto as well. And it's wonderful to be here speaking to you today. And big thanks for the invitation and for your attention. So I'm speaking today about the topic of AI ethics in health, and specifically research ethics, insights that came from the Global Forum on Bioethics in Research that was held a couple of years ago now in South Africa. So I'll continue on to elaborate a bit on, specifically what we uncovered and where our dialogue led in that meeting. But wanted to say that I'll frame my talk today in terms of big questions for AI ethics and health. So I'll summarize the insights in a paper that came from the Global Forum on Bioethics and Research, but we'll do so in the context of kind of encouraging some deeper thinking about this. And I'll also say that I'm joining you on this talk today from Treaty 13 territory in Toronto, which has for many generations been the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, and the Seneca. So thank you, and I'll move on to my outline. So in terms of the context here, I'll review a bit about AI, public health, and big thinking about the longer term. Then I'll review sort of big questions in these four specific domains: data quality and governance, power, control, and benefit, matching solutions to problems, and then understanding impacts. And then I'll move on to some conclusions, which really is just about sort of directions for governance. And of course, these are a bit different in every sort of jurisdiction around the world, but there are some common themes that I think we will all want to be paying attention to. So I'm going to start out by framing these comments in relation to this idea of the between times. And this concept comes from this book that I'm showing here, Power and Prediction: The Disruptive Economics of AI, written by some economists here at the University of Toronto, where they're looking at kind of the long-term prospects of AI and how it will transform different industries. And they give this concept of the between times to represent the difference between the state of the art of AI technology versus the systems into which they'll be embedded. And they pose this question of which industries are actually ready to adopt AI, and of course the answer will be that it turns out not that many. Now, this book was written a couple of years ago, and things have changed, quite a lot in the last year or two. What I see in the health sector is that many organizations are now turning their attention in earnest to developing AI-related strategies, governance approaches, and policies as well. But these authors point toward the development of the light bulb, the invention of the light bulb, and how long it took from that instant to the ready availability of lighting in households, in streets, as basic infrastructure in the United States specifically. And they identify this like approximately 40-year period that they call the between times between the invention of a truly new technology and its everyday use, among sort of the general public. So that's, a helpful framing, I think, for us to think about the work that needs to be done between what's been accomplished in the last sort of 5 years in particular in relation to AI and what that future state is. And I've done some work with colleagues sorting out what some of those challenges will be. But certainly I think this remains important and helpful framing. And for me, it points toward the fact that there are enormous controversies that need to be addressed during these between times if AI is going to work for healthcare and public health. So that kind of frames the comments I'll make today. So the screenshot of the article here is the one that arose from the Global Forum on Bioethics and Research when the topic was artificial intelligence at that meeting. And as part of that meeting, we had several conversations. One was about how are we thinking about AI? And an important distinction that we made early on was the distinction between AI used for discovering things, like drug discovery, AI and science, that kind of thing, versus AI for intervention. That would be something like the automation of a particular task or clinical decision support systems that actually provide an intervention into public health or healthcare delivery. And we also acknowledged that there's different ways of understanding the consequences of AI, both in the immediate and longer terms, right? There's real potential immediate value of AI in public health in particular. AI can help with documentation. It can help to produce more accurate predictions of things like disease patterns and transmission and so on. These are some examples of a variety of particular use cases for AI in public health that have been fairly widely discussed in the literature and applied in different parts of the world as well. And at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that social structures will also evolve as AI becomes a more prominent part of global economies. And as this paper from last summer shows, inequities will also grow as a result. So I think this is important to acknowledge because even as public health practitioners around the world incorporate AI into their work, the fact of AI in the global economy will also produce changes in the context in which we have to do our work as public health researchers and practitioners. Where a huge part of our mission is to address health inequities, and AI contributes to those inequities, we will need to find ways to counteract that impact. So, returning to the meeting, the Global Forum on Bioethics in Research, what were some key themes that emerged from the global dialogue at that conference? This is an invitational conference sponsored by the World Health Organization. We had over 80 attendees from many countries around the world, every inhabited continent represented. And had dialogue over 2.5 days that led to the observations and recommendations that I'm sharing here. So first key theme related to whether it's appropriate to build AI in the first place. And this was, really an important point that there's all this hype around artificial intelligence, but it's not the best solution to every problem. And that needs to be acknowledged. So this was an important sort of first theme. A second was around the transferability of AI to new contexts. Where an AI model is built in one country, what needs to be done for it to transfer to another country? Is it even appropriate? Can it solve the problem as it exists in a different place? So the transferability of these models is a second important consideration. Third is around accountability for AI decision making and outcomes. Accountability is a topic that's discussed quite a lot in relation to AI in healthcare and public health. And it's quite standard, quite typical to see vendors, technology companies, pushing accountability away from themselves as much as possible. That's a sort of survival strategy for many of these vendors. But that leaves those of us working in public health and healthcare to make challenging decisions about how much risk we're willing to take on and where we want accountabilities to lie for the consequences of AI technologies when deployed in healthcare and public health. Those outcomes that accrue over time, where are the accountabilities for those consequences? So that remains a really important topic internationally. And then fourth and finally on these overarching themes related to individual consent. Is the individual consent model still relevant? What are ways that we should be thinking about consent differently, given the nature of the development of these AI models, how they're trained, and where data come from to inform the development of these models? So, taking a step back from that and thinking about some of these big questions, how might we prompt deeper reflection on these issues? And the nature of the questions I'm posing here is intended to get at, precisely that. So we'll see if we can accomplish that goal. So the first kind of domain is around data quality and governance, and there are two questions I pose here specifically. First, what is the quality of the data on which models are being trained, and who decides how the data are used? And in relation to the first question here, what's the quality of the data? I point to some work by an American scholar, Taylor Cruz, and she does work going into what are called safety net hospitals, typically serving members of low-income communities. And she looks at how data are collected, who's doing the data collection, what's happening in their surround when they take an observation clinically and put it into the computer system that becomes a part of the health record, which then gets used for the development of AI models. And the point here is that there's a social life of these data, that they don't come from nowhere. It's not simply a matter of clean, obvious one-to-one relations between the world and what gets represented in the data. There are other considerations, social considerations that get built into the collection of data as well. So the point here is that where the data come from, how they've been collected and what they're viewed as representing, these are important and not necessarily obvious considerations. In relation to the second question here, who decides how data are used? I'll point here to some other work that I've done with a colleague in the UK, Sharifa Sekalala, proposing this concept of health data justice. And here we're suggesting that, actually when we're asking questions about data, it's less about the data themselves and more about the trustworthiness of the institutions that are collecting and using that data. And ultimately arguing that community members themselves need to be much more deeply involved in decisions about which data are collected and what are the appropriate uses of those data beyond delivering care. So these are important questions about data that, of course, frame uses of AI in healthcare and public health. So thinking then about who's making these decisions, power, control, and who benefits, I would pose two questions specifically. So first, who benefits from building AI, both directly and indirectly, and who controls AI resources? So these are important questions about the global context of these technologies, how they're developed, and how they are distributed around the world. And there's great work that's been done by a scholar from the Netherlands, Tamar Sharon, looking at the activities of big tech as they gain entry into public services like healthcare and public health. And there are, in this work, they provide a sort of detailed description of what happens in the industries, in the institutions of healthcare, as technology companies work their way into the delivery of care. But in essence, they point toward the fact that the expectations and the institutional processes of healthcare are at risk of shifting in the favor of big technology companies. And as that happens over time and those changes accrue, we could see entire institutions of healthcare and public health sort of bend toward the expectations and processes of Silicon Valley, of big technology companies. So this is sort of raising a flag, raising awareness about the fact that there is risk of an institutions shifting toward the interests of big tech. If we're not aware of that and working to govern relationships with those companies, very explicitly and purposefully. And then, second, who controls the AI resources? I mean, this is, a really important question about the global distribution of power and responsibility in this regard. And drawing on some work with an international group of colleagues here, we've pointed to the sort of root challenge of the inequitable distribution of power and resources in this regard, and how that produces a global system in which a very small group of corporations controls the design, distribution, use, and governance of these technologies in ways that obviously fuel digital divides. So, this is a deeply rooted challenge in the history, the colonial history of the world. That is something that, we need to be clear-eyed about. We need to see this clearly to understand the role of this technology in producing or worsening existing inequities. Then on to thinking about AI as a solution to problems. Are there real problems for which AI is the most appropriate solution? And the questions that I would pose here are, first, do we really need AI for this? And second, what do communities think about this? Because if we're positioning communities as the ones to make decisions about how data are mobilized to inform governance, then promoting community involvement is essential. So in relation to the first point, do we really need AI for this? I was struck by this relatively early from 2021 paper that critiqued this AI for social good idea. Of course, it's better to use AI for social good than the opposite of that, which would be the further concentration of power and wealth. But even AI for social good may have challenges inherent in that notion. And in this paper, Holzmeier describes how AI for good can't fix the housing crisis. As an example, there's a global housing crisis. This requires, much deeper thinking beyond the existing tools that we may have available to us, such as AI. And I point here to a project funded by CIFAR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, which is a project that I'm working on, AI for Diabetes Prediction and Prevention, where we're mobilizing an algorithm in close collaboration with a public health unit to better predict the onset and complications of diabetes. And this was developed in collaboration with the region and is addressing a real problem that they have. Now, it's not as simple and clear cut as that. I'll elaborate a bit on that further, but just to highlight the sort of distinction here around, what are the problems that we're suggesting? I'm happy to say that that's changing, and the publication I show here is an example of a framework and sort of a toolkit around how to do this. But certainly in this particular domain, much more work is needed to explore what are the ways that communities think about AI, what are the ways to partner with communities in the development and deployment of AI initiatives that enable community governance. I think that's a really crucial direction for development in the field. So then on to kind of the last collection of questions around understanding impacts. And would pose here first the question, what are the benefits and harms of AI? What are they really? And this is not just the immediate outcomes that we tend to pay attention to in healthcare and public health, but longer term and hidden outcomes as well. And secondly here, how should AI be governed? And I'll come back to my comments about community governance in relation to this question in a moment. So as far as the benefits and harms of AI, I want to point to this paper that is making a case for a broader understanding of the potential harms, the risks and harms of AI. And I mean, an obvious example here, climate-related impacts of the development of these models. The requirement for data centers, the amount of water they need, the carbon production of the process as a whole. I mean, there are, of course, at this point, it's fairly widely known that there are enormous climate impacts from the development of large language models and other big AI models. So how do we incorporate that into our understanding, into our impact analysis of AI technologies in healthcare and public health? So we need to be able to take this broader perspective and understand this broader range of implications. Then in terms of how should AI be governed, I've already referred to this. I do acknowledge that there's this sort of emerging literature in this topic area around this concept of collaborative governance for health-related AI. So this is, one piece in Nature Medicine, I believe it was, and there are others. But the point being that community governance is a central aspect, and still community is not the only one. There are other interest holders in this broader ecosystem. And so taking a step back and understanding how these actors need to come together to make good decisions that protect the public interest is really important. And I think at this point we are missing case studies about the positive benefits of good, transparent, community-oriented governance of these kinds of AI initiatives. So I think this is one domain where the research community can really step up and document our processes for community engagement and write about those and seek out publications so that we can build a record around, doing this in good ways. So then, continuing this commentary, what does this mean for governance? And here I'm returning to the key insights that we learned from the Global Forum on Bioethics and Research. So there are several of these recommendations. They appear over 2 slides, and I'll just briefly walk through each of them. The first point here is that people in governance positions, and in the paper we refer to these people as governance leaders. Probably you all listening to this are contributors to governance in one way or another. And so you would be included as an audience member for these kinds of recommendations. So first, remaining up to date on recent advances in regulation of AI for health. I mean, particularly now, this is a rapidly changing domain. I mean, we can anticipate that particular jurisdictions in the world are heading in particular directions, but as governments change over and the global political economy shifts, these can shift quickly as well. The way that AI is regulated, particularly in relation to health, will continue to evolve rapidly. It's a time of immense change and therefore immense opportunity to influence what foundations are laid as far as the governance of AI for health. Second is to focus on the ethical governance of data. And I've talked about this already and some emerging models for how to do this. But governing AI means governing data. And so attending to ethical governance of data is a core part of this conversation. Third is to incorporate AI impact assessments. And I've talked a bit about how we're thinking about impact. We do need to think more broadly and in particular timeframes about the impact of AI technologies in healthcare and public health. Fourth is to incorporate environmental impact assessments. Of course, these two are closely related. We decided to call out environmental impact assessments as its own category because of the deep salience, the urgency of the climate crisis and the climate impacts of AI technologies, among the many technologies that are harming the environment internationally. And then finally here is to promote transparency in AI development. And I mean, this, of course, is a tricky one. There are efforts internationally, such as through the development of something called model cards, where vendors or developers will record sort of key information about the development process and the performance of AI models on like a sort of information pamphlet or a card that is accessible in relation to each AI model developed. But I mean, also so much of the development of these models constitutes trade secrets. It's proprietary knowledge that isn't shared or can't be shared. So exploring ways to promote transparency in the model development and its marketing and sales process as well are really important. So on to these kind of final set of recommendations coming from the Global Forum. First here, promote community engagement across phases of AI development. I won't elaborate further on that piece. I feel that I've already said quite a bit about that. Second is to encourage fair partnership between researchers and organizations in different jurisdictions. And this is where we see the concentration of AI development occurring in particular regions of the world, where people in those regions are building partnerships with other regions that have fewer resources in relation to AI. Finding ways to build fair partnerships is essential. And that can be through things like revenue sharing or the sharing of intellectual resources in some other way. But that's just the starting point. There are many other ways and many other considerations in the development of such fair partnerships. Third here is to explore new forms of regulatory experimentation for AI. Where can we build models, sort of pilots, examples of good governance around AI? Where can we try out new approaches to regulation? These kinds of things could be enormously beneficial for the global community, and we would suggest sort of promoting that both domestically in sort of regions around the world and, of course, through global coordination wherever possible. Finally is to evolve the structures and capabilities of governance functions. One of the kind of core insights in the research ethics community is that there needs to be enormous work done to enhance the capabilities of research ethics boards in reviewing research involving AI. And you can see that there's work to boost capacity around the world. This work exists and it's sort of taking off, but an enormous gap remains. And just personally, I find that there's an enormous expertise gap here, and that really interferes with the public sector's ability to adequately govern relationships with vendors in particular. So, these are our recommendations that came from the Global Forum. And just shifting into my concluding comments, now I want to point to this visual, which represents all of the organizations involved in the governance of AI in Canada alone. And you can see that it's enormously complex. So promoting coordination across these different organizations, it's an enormously complex challenge. So that's a reality. This is the current state. And I think that our collective work going forward will in many ways be about figuring out the details of this puzzle. How do they relate to one another? How can we ensure that each of these domains protects the public interest when contemplating and acting on the procurement and deployment of AI technologies in healthcare and public health? So on to a few conclusions, just to kind of review here. So I began by talking about the context of the between times AI use cases in public health and thinking through the longer term. Then reviewed some insights from the Global Forum on Bioethics and dug more deeply into questions in these 4 domains around data, around power and control, around matching solutions to problems, and understanding impacts. And in conclusions, I reviewed some insights around governance from the Global Forum and highlighted the importance of community-focused governance as well. And with that, I'll say thank you so much, and I will look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shah, for that insightful lecture on the major and regulatory challenges surrounding AI in health. Your reflections on responsibility, equity, and governance are especially relevant to the discussions we've been having in this course. We'll now move into the Q&A portion of our lecture today. So we've invited participants to submit their questions, and we'll go ahead and read them aloud for you to respond. So if you're ready, we'll begin with the first question.
Yeah, thank you. Please go ahead.
So the first question is, what are some of the most common inequities we should be concerned about?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Stanley. I think that's a great question. And there's several different ways to answer that. I mean, that paper that I showed illustrating how AI will increase inequities was referring to social and economic inequities over the longer term, rooted in this sort of increasingly something becoming common knowledge in the field of economics that AI is likely to amass the greatest social and economic benefit to people already in control of AI resources. So, people with existing wealth and social capital to learn quickly about emerging AI technologies, new advances in AI technologies, and leverage those advances to their benefit. Whereas like workers or the sort of mass public is likely to be much slower to acquire any benefit and in fact be subject to the sort of economic systems produced by the control of power among those with the social capital and resources to benefit from AI quickly and early. So, what are the biggest sort of inequities to be concerned about? I think if we take a step back, even from, healthcare and public health and think in the big picture, it's the further concentration of wealth and resources among a small few people and corporations that will continue to exert control over where AI goes and continue to reap the economic benefits of that. And there will be kind of social and economic shifts as a result of that further concentration of wealth. So my sort of first and foremost answer to your question is about that broader social economic system and who's benefiting economically from investments in AI. I think there are also many inequities, specifically within applications of AI in healthcare and public health that we need to pay attention to. So things like, for example, looking at the data, how are data sets developed, where are data being pulled from in the development of these models, and are those data, themselves biased? Are there, for example, racial biases or racism embedded in data sets that are being used to train AI models? These kinds of things will produce other inequities in the context of like those specific use cases. So I would say there's kind of at least 2 different classes of inequities to be really aware of. One is the broader sort of social world system, social economic system. The other are new inequities or exacerbated inequities that are introduced through specific applications of AI in our fields, public health or healthcare. So I would leave my response to that first question there. So, thanks.
Thank you. The next question is, when an AI system makes a mistake in a healthcare setting, who should be held responsible?
Yeah, I mean, so This is in relation to some of the earlier comments about accountability. And I mean, I think that this is a really tricky question, having talked to vendors and health professionals and like legal staff, legal teams, lawyers at hospitals and other organizations about how accountability works in this space. I mean, in many nations, the kind of final accountability for the decisions that get made in healthcare rest with, what's called the most responsible provider, MRP, most responsible provider. And in the vast majority of cases, that's the physician who is primarily responsible for a patient's care. So, I mean, this is like to be the holder of accountability in that case, is an enormous responsibility, an enormous amount of work, and an enormous expectation of knowledge, expert or at least working knowledge. And at the same time, I think this is the position that physicians hold in healthcare and in some ways in public health as well. So, I mean, ultimately, I think that accountability should be more shared than that in this particular case, where a vendor, so a group, company that's developed a technology and sold that technology for use in healthcare or public health, um, where they've made promises about what the technology can do, about their checks and balances, how they're auditing the technology to ensure that its effects are positive, and that it's not making errors, then there needs to be a shared accountability with the vendor, the company as well. So I think who should be accountable, who should be responsible. I think ultimately that needs to be shared between the most responsible provider or public health policymaker making a particular decision. They're in those positions of authority. They have a lot of training. They're well paid, compensated because they hold that responsibility. But that needs to be shared with the vendor, the company that's making promises about what a technology will do. There's naturally an expertise gap between those two, the vendor and the content expert. And so I think we're seeing this worked out right now, partly in courts, the way like court systems are adjudicating cases about accountability, and partly through the agreements that are made between vendors and healthcare delivery organizations as they build partnerships to implement AI technologies. So ultimately, I think accountability needs to be shared, and that there's a big role for the vendor and for the most responsible healthcare provider. So thank you. Great question.
Thank you. The next question is, do you think AI in healthcare should be governed by global laws, or should regulation be handled locally by individual countries or communities?
Yeah, thank you. I see that question in the chat too. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we could all agree, around the world, everyone could agree on a particular set of laws, and regulations that would govern the development and marketing and deployment of AI in the public interest. But I think the fact is the world we live in is just far more complicated than that, right? I saw one of the questions was about how do we align AI with values? When we have like different values in South Africa versus Kenya versus Canada versus China, right? Like we live in a deeply pluralistic world. And I mean, the older I get, the more I realize life is so much about just figuring out how to navigate and get along with people when there are those different values, right? On a global scale. Geopolitics is about bringing different beliefs about what matters most in life together, to ideally harmonize, to live peacefully together in some way. And so the idea that the entire global community could come together to produce a single consensus on how to govern AI, I mean, I'm not as optimistic that that's a realistic immediate next step for us. And there are things like the global meeting on the governance of AI in France this past January 2025, where, in fact, for the first time, there was a really clear schism, a gap between where groups like the United States, and other sort of economically developed countries wanted to go, and others. Like there was a big gap between the sort of directions in which countries are headed on how they want to govern AI. I mean, one thing I will say is that I think that AI governance needs to be sector specific. Having global AI laws, I mean, Europe has just gone this route, and so we'll see how well that becomes applied to particular use cases. But, particularly in relation to healthcare and public health, there's I think, a unique set of considerations around governance that need to be applied specifically to the health sector that are very different from, the financial sector, for example. So regulation around AI should probably be different in those different sectors. Now, I think one thing we do see among many nations is cooperation around health technology assessment. So things like medicines. When a big pharma company wants to market a medicine, there needs to be a process of documenting if it's safe and effective, and agencies from countries around the world coordinate to share insights about that, the safety and effectiveness of drugs. So, certainly there can and should be a similar kind of cooperation internationally for AI in ways that would inform local country-specific governance and regulatory decisions around AI. I'll leave that one there.
Thank you.
Oh,
The next question, and you touched on some parts of this question. So you spoke about long-term risks. Could widespread AI deployment destabilize economies or worsen inequality? Is there a risk of AI outpacing human control, and how can we ensure that AI systems remain aligned with human values, especially across different cultural contexts like South Africa, Kenya, or Canada, and across generations? And please feel free to ask me to repeat any parts of the question.
sure, thanks. I'm also following along in the chat, so it's helpful to see it written down. I think this is a great question. Obviously, you've been reflecting on this topic area for some time. And I mean, I do think that we are in sort of murky territory, unclear. It's foggy. It's unclear what to make in particular of this point about existential risk. There was an article, a blog post, and publication that came from the AI research firm Anthropic a couple of months ago, where they documented a number of things that their AI model was doing to, in the spirit of self-preservation, to keep itself alive. When the engineers had threatened to take it offline or to deconstruct the model, it had said it would blackmail one of the engineers by emailing false information about an affair that the engineer had had to people in its contact list. And I mean, in addition to that, there's this sort of subculture dialogue around something called the dead internet, which is pointing to this mass amount of internet content that's just generated by AIs, by bots, interacting back and forth, much of it nonsensical. And so we are starting to see our digital environments being reshaped, polluted, changed by AI technologies. So, yes, I do think that there's a real risk, particularly around, for example, the growing number of bots in social media and the effect that has in shifting political sentiment, for example. So I think that's a good example of existential or near existential risk. But yeah, I mean, I also I observe the difference of opinion among experts about existential risk. And I find myself in somewhat of a balanced position. Like, I'm not saying that there's, no risk of an AI, exceeding the guardrails placed on it in order to accomplish a particular goal. I think that's in the realm of the possible. And at the same time, I think that it would be because of the irresponsible business practices of the corporations developing those technologies. They are the ones responsible and accountable for what these large language models do online. So, I mean, do I think there's a risk? Yes, I do. I think that people like us need to be paying very close attention to this domain and advocating to our local political representatives and others participating in governance conversations to raise the profile of these risks and ensure that there's cooperation on governance and wherever possible legislation as well. And I think, yeah, I think that's an important part of the work that we're doing as we attend to, protect and promote the public's health. And then, so I'm just looking at the next part of your question. How can we ensure AI is aligned with values across cultures? I mean, I think this is a particularly tricky point because, I, you know, like to what extent, I would pose the question, to what extent is there a universal set of values across cultures to which we would align AI? And I think like there are certain things, golden rule and, don't kill people. Like there are certain sort of truisms that as humans we tend to agree on. Of course, context is everything. And so the outputs of these large language models, ChatGPT, Claude, and others, there needs to be this kind of constant updating and iteration of these models such that they are appropriate, applicable, and constructive in different cultural contexts. So, I mean, ChatGPT, for example, is trained on GPT-4, a general processor. And that general processor is an AI model that can accomplish, extraordinary feats. It gets channeled through, into a particular application. We log in and interact with ChatGPT, but that model is used to build a wide variety of particular kinds of applications, and its outputs are funneled, trained, modulated to appear in a particular way as we such that it's useful as we interact with it. So yes, there certainly are mechanisms for preventing particular language and promoting other kinds of language that comes from a model like that. Having a way to do that internationally, having incentives on the corporations to do that, these are, I think, really important questions, and it would be through the demand of people in those environments that I think that kind of where that kind of sort of set of steps would come to be, and at root here is the Americans' colonial history, right? The U.S. is an imperial nation, and it supports technology companies in that same mentality. ChatGPT, the English language, American values, Silicon Valley, like these ideas, cultures, norms are exported around the world. And so until people demand that there are different kinds of values that show up in their applications of AI, the commonly accepted practice will just continue. If community partnership is difficult, how can one ensure that in global health? Yes. And so, I mean, this sort of last piece of this question. I think that like considering the governance of these technologies, building in public deliberation, dialogue, community governance is, I think, fundamental. And there are different paradigms for doing this. You can't ask everyone, right? You can't ask everyone their opinion, but there's a way to construct sort of surveys and deliberations, dialogue about people's shifting, emerging understandings of AI, what's acceptable to them over time, going to different communities. I mean, ultimately, I'm calling for a whole field and a whole set of investments about doing public engagement, community engagement in a way that directly informs governance, like the world over. And, I know that these corporations do this work. They do it to identify what their customer base is after. I know governments do this work to inform what governance should look like. But I think that it's deeply underinvested in at the moment, and there needs to be far more work in doing that. So I don't know how to do it in global health. There's a way. There needs to be more funding and good people who are working out systems to make that happen. So thank you for those great questions, and I'll put it back to I believe it's Saif who's asking questions.
Thank you. The next question, in relation to consent and data use, should we be moving forward toward federated learning models where individuals retain control and must consent before their data is used?
Yeah, I think federated learning models is a really important approach to building AI machine learning technologies. It offers obvious benefits when it comes to things like providing consent, respecting data governance and possession laws where data can't shift between borders, for example. So I think that we do see big projects, particularly in medical AI or health-related AI, where federated learning is being used, to great benefit. And I also think that there's, the biggest models, the biggest companies doing AI are far less interested in that because the regulations and the issues around consent just aren't nearly as relevant for them as they are for people building boutique applications of AI specifically for healthcare and public health. So yes, very promising, definitely worthy of research grants and government investment, specifically for AI models in healthcare and public health. So yeah, thank you. Great point.
Thank you. The next question is, you noted that building meaningful community partnerships in Canada is already complex. In a global health context where power imbalances and cultural differences are even greater, how can we ensure that partnerships are ethical and equitable?
I mean, that kind of builds on comments I was just making about community engagement and governance on an international scale. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have more to add in relation to that. I think the key point is that, you've articulated a set of values that should characterize what community engagement and partnership looks like on a global scale. And now it's about building the systems for fulfilling those values. And there's a researcher at the University of Warwick named Meg Davis who has a project called the Digital and Human Rights Project, I think it's called. And in 4 countries around the world, she's invested in these big teams. There's strong local engagement. It's all about, precisely what you're talking about. But it's required dedicated funding, and the long-term commitment of a fairly large group of people. So I think figuring out where that funding comes from and what the systems look like to accomplish that, longitudinally is the challenge and something that, certainly needs to be invested in.
Thank you. The next question is, how can we ensure ethical accountability and transparency in AI-driven healthcare systems, especially when the decision-making processes of some of these deep learning models are often opaque or black box in nature?
Yeah, I think accountability and transparency are two different ideas, both of which are, of course, very important. I think that the conversation about transparency has evolved from when concerns around transparency were initially introduced, sort of 8 or 10 years ago. Transparency, I think, has shifted into a conversation about like transparent about what, because human decision making is not transparent, and where like human physicians, for example, give an account of how a complex decision was made, it can usually only be given in retrospect. There are complications around that. So acknowledging that not all aspects of the way that a model produces a prediction or an output can be transparent. What are the pieces that require transparency? And there's also a field of work, people building AI technologies to provide an account, a description of how a model produced a particular outcome. So, I mean, I think that by being more specific about what we need to be transparent on, which data were most salient in the model that produced this output, for example, which data is the model considering? Because there are things we may not want the model to consider, right, in making a particular decision. So transparency about specific things in the way a model operates. And then in terms of accountability, this is kind of back to an earlier comment about who do we need to be accountable, and what do we need them to be accountable for? And I mean, there are people, internationally doing really good work, thinking specifically about how are we treating accountability in these contexts. There's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Milan named Joseph Donia, who's written a great paper about this, showing 5 different ways that accountability has been used in literature on AI and health in particular. So, I mean, again, I think it's an idea that we need to think more specifically about when we say accountable. What do we mean? Accountable for what and by whom? So, I think there are ways to accomplish these, but gaining like conceptual clarity about what we're actually asking for when we ask for accountability and transparency is a really important starting point. So maybe I'll leave that one there.
Thank you. The next question is, should AI systems be given greater to private health data, even if it increases privacy risks, if doing so could lead to better health outcomes or save more lives? And how should we balance individual privacy with potential public benefits? And how or what would you prioritize in that trade-off?
Hmm. That's a great question. And this is something where, so the first thing that comes to my mind is to point toward the work by a scholar in Vienna named Barbara Prainsack. Her and her colleagues have developed this concept of data solidarity, which, ultimately from a public health perspective says that where the uses of data are intended to provide public value, then as a matter of our sort of shared responsibility to contribute to the health of the public, we should be giving access to our private health data in order to support the development of public value and public good. Even that concept of solidarity, data solidarity, is of less interest in the US, in American context, because of the different set of political values as relates to the concept of solidarity. So I think this is like a very cultural question. How important is privacy to, a particular culture? There are some cultures where privacy is less important than other cultures. And so the privacy of health data would have less import would be less important to them than it would be in other jurisdictions. So I think that the response to this question depends on an exploration of the local values that characterize people's sense of health data privacy and their perceived commitment to or any concerns with sharing their data to be built into AI models. So this is an example again where I think the answer is fairly context specific. So I'll leave it there, and we probably have maybe time for one more question.
Yep, this is the last question.
Okay, thank you.
So as AI systems increasingly rely on multi-modal data, including text, images, and sensor inputs, how can we design community engagement frameworks that ensure representative participation and center local values throughout the entire AI lifecycle, from design to deployment and monitoring?
Great question. And I think an important signal around how our conversation about data is shifting and will continue to shift. Multimodal models, capable of ingesting different kinds of data, and if you think about this, video data, closed capture television, CCTV, video data, images that we post about ourselves online, text, our voice, YouTube. Like if you think about these different modalities of data being, brought together and producing certain capabilities, most importantly, I think things like deep fakes, misconstruing what people have done or said, making it appear that they've done or said things that have not happened. I mean, these are really, really important. And from a sort of global equity perspective, the deep diversity of visual identity, spoken identity, language, all of the deeply diverse characteristics that represent the globe, the world. I mean, I would sort of reiterate the question here. How do we ensure all of that becomes represented, embedded in the outputs of AI that are being applied to us, to each of you in your particular context? Is it relevant to you? The kinds of data being fed into those models, are they representative of your community, your region, your country, whatever it may be? And I mean, if we look at how the biggest models are trained currently, it's on the entire internet, basically, right? They're trolling mass amounts of publicly available text, visual, audio, video data from that's been posted online. So to the extent that we want that to be better curated, that would be within the defined boundaries of a particular kind of AI initiative. Building a radiology algorithm to detect something on an image, for example, would depend on having the right diversity of images, such that ultimately that model could generalize to any image that it encounters in the wild, right? When deployed in real life. So I think that this defining what data need to be used to build a particular model, the consent parameters, whether that's primary explicit consent or secondary consent, which is embedded in many jurisdictions' health data policy. Defining what kind of data, what the consent parameters are, how the data will be used, how it will be audited to ensure that diverse diverse uses, applications, sort of patients are represented, that the model performs accurately for everyone. There are good methods for all of this. Algorithmic audits is an important one. That's something you could certainly look up if it's not something you know more about. There are defined methods for ensuring that a model works on a diverse set of sort of socio-demographic characteristics, for example. So I think that your point highlights the importance of that. It underscores the sort of heightened value and awareness around these different kinds of data that are being incorporated, but that the sort of core dimensions of consent, secondary use, algorithmic audit, that we have these basic insights in place, and it just it heightens the importance of those pieces going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Shah, for sharing your expertise and for addressing these important questions on AI ethics and regulation in healthcare. Your insights have given us a lot to reflect on as we think about the role of AI in global health systems. I'd also like to thank all of our participants for your thoughtful questions and an active engagement today. We look forward to seeing you all at our next session, and thank you again for being part of today's discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks so much.